Hello everyone, I am Anthropomantic Fiend, and I do horror-related things on the internet. And you probably know why we're here if you clicked on the video. But before I do that, I do want to make another addendum to something I said in one of the last videos I uploaded, because I put out my review of the movie Flowers near the beginning of Pride Month. And in that, I basically detailed that I am genderqueer / gender fluid and that my pronouns are he, they. However, I very recently made a little addendum to that. If you can see that new gender fluid pride pin that I got, I am going by he, they, and she now. I am gender fluid, and I am kind of all over the place when it comes to gender. So that can fluctuate from day to day or over the course of a day. But all of these things are acceptable, and it would also be greatly appreciated if you could use more than one of them, especially if the one of them is he. But it's also really nice because it is now very hard to misgender me. Regardless of that, or kind of in tandem with that, it is still Pride Month, nearing the end of it. Hopefully I can get this out before Pride Month ends. But back in June of 2021, when I came out as Arrow Ace, I did a video detailing a bunch of different LGBTQ, IA+, horror things that I wanted to recommend. And I am deciding to do that again now. I still haven't found much of anything in the way of Ace or Arrow representation in horror. I know Trinchy recommended me something from American Horror Story where a character is Ace, but that's not really anything that's actually addressed. So please, if you find asexual or aromantic representation in anything related to horror, please let me know. So overall, I'm going to be looking at 4 different categories of things and 4 things in each of those categories. And those are going to be books, movies, TV, and YouTube content creators. I wanted to look at things that don't just have explicitly queer rep in them, which is what I did in my last video, but I'm also going to be branching out into things that also have queer coded things or things that I read as queer or just had a queer sensibility to them in my eyes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is and why I think you should check these things out. Also, I expanded my horizons because explicit queer representation that hasn't been talked about a million times already is very hard to find. And I wish that was not the case. But without further ado, here is the second part of my recommendations for LGBTQIA+ horror, starting with books. If you are going to ask if all of the queer horror books I'm going to recommend are about vampires, obviously. And the first of those is going to be The Moth Diaries by Rachel Klein. I have talked about the movie adaptation of The Moth Diaries directed by Mary Harron of American Psycho fame multiple times. I adore that movie. I think it has a beautiful atmosphere, some great acting, and a wonderful little conspiracy murder mystery aspect to it, and a very psychological aspect. As great as the movie is, and as much as I think I'm going to revisit that movie endless times, the stuff that is in this book isn't really done justice. This is not an explicitly queer book in any way, really. It references Carmilla multiple times, as that is one of the things that they are reading in school, and the dynamic of the character of Ernessa, the suspected vampire, as she relates to the main character and her various friends, feels very similar to Carmilla and the kind of elaborate con game she plays with her victims. But what this book does is it sows a lot of doubt in your mind as to whether or not Ernessa is actually a vampire, or if the unnamed narrator who's writing all of these journal entries, because this is basically an epistolary novel. It is done as a series of journal entries, is becoming progressively more paranoid and venting all these awful feelings towards Ernessa, and it is causing her to do all of these awful things kind of in tandem with this past trauma she's having that's probably causing her to slip out of sanity a little bit. So, not a cheery book in any way whatsoever, but a beautifully written book. And the thing that I think makes this book very queer, at least in a subtextual way, is the inclusion of the Carmilla aspects, but also the kind of strange, othered way the protagonist relates to other female characters around her, because she is in this all-girls boarding school where everybody else around her is just talking about boys all the time. That isn't something that really interests her, and she says multiple times, I'm not a lesbian or anything. This has nothing to do with sexuality. I'm just looking at these other girls and being like, I want to spend all of this time with you, and I'm kind of horrifyingly jealous of you, and it kind of makes me resent you at the same time, but I also want to be you and be all of these things about you. And she also kind of gets the sense that Ernessa is doing the same thing and kind of just vampirically absorbing the traits of different people around her until they are just not themselves anymore, and then they die. And there's just this weird blurring of the lines between love, whether that be romantic or platonic or sexual, and hatred and resentment, even this just kind of envy and this wanting to be the other person and kind of absorb their traits, that all just kind of blurs into this obsession. And I think that, whether it means to or not, is very much a accurate depiction of what it feels like to be a sheltered queer person, where suddenly you're feeling a bunch of feelings and you have no idea if the people around you feel that way or not. So you might just assume that it's normal, but it is impossible to sort out what these intense feelings you're having mean, what you actually feel towards this person. Do I love them? Do I resent them because I think they're better than me? Do I actually want to be them? It just feels very representative of the kind of confusion of feelings that may happen to, anybody in adolescence, but especially if you're queer and the things that you're feeling are not feelings that have been normalized, it becomes that much more confusing and horrific. And when that meshes with all of this vampire stuff and all of this past trauma that the protagonist has, it just becomes this horrifying psychological mess written in this very beautiful way. And then there's also just the aspect of her absolute obsession with Lucy, which, regardless of what that feeling actually is, feels very queer. Not explicit queer representation, but the overall vibe and things that are addressed in this book feel like they would resonate with other queer people. So if you are any form of queer and you have read this book, let me know if you vibed with it in that same way. The next book I'm going to talk about is The Tale of the Body Thief by Anne Rice. This is the fourth book in the Vampire Chronicles. So we've already had Interview with the Vampire, Vampire Lestat, and Queen of the Damned. This book follows Lestat kind of on his own little side journey that you can really read if you haven't even read any of the other Vampire Chronicles, although reading the other ones really does enrich the experience of this book. And basically, he's approached by this guy who has the ability to swap bodies with people. He's like, hey, Lestat, I know you kind of miss the ways of being human and you're kind of bored in your vampire body right now. I'll make a deal with you and we can swap bodies for a little while and then swap back. And Lestat's like, say no more. Absolutely. He ignores all the potential red flags of the situation, makes the body swap with the person. This guy promptly is like, whoa, look at all these vampire powers that I absolutely cannot control, and crashes through a window and goes screaming off into the distance with his newfound uncontrollable vampire powers, and Lestat is left with this feeble puny human body that has all of these aches and hurts and things that he had forgotten about after centuries and didn't think he'd have to deal with anymore. There's a whole scene where he has to take a piss for the first time in centuries, and he's like, why do humans have to do this still? Again, the actual specific themes of it aren't explicitly queer, but despite everything that's already happened in the Vampire Chronicles, this is one of the first outright statements of queerness in the Vampire Chronicles series, because we've had these passionate relationships that Lestat has with other male figures and that Louis has with other male figures, and characters like Gabrielle, who kind of feel transcoded in the way that they defy gender presentation expectations as soon as they become vampires. But in this, we get the first outright declaration from Lestat that he is bisexual, in that he says the words, "I have always loved both men and women." But beyond that, there does just seem to be something very queer about body swap stories, even though this is a body swap story detailing two AMAB, assigned male at birth, male genitalia bodies that swap with each other. This idea of wishing your body was not what it is at that moment and being frustrated with what that is feels like a very queer experience, especially for trans or non-binary people. But even more so than that, this kind of addresses in this kind of offhand way the way all of the vampires within the Vampire Chronicles are kind of coded as being on the asexual spectrum in some ways as well, because they always express these passionate desires towards each other, but all of them are expressed through bloodletting, or just, in the case of Lestat and Louis, just kind of needling at each other and being very toxic. But there's no actual sex acts performed or anything, because for the vampires, none of the plumbing actually works, which is not what asexual is, but there is something very much on the ace spectrum about the way the vampires are portrayed, in that they have these very intense, passionate feelings towards each other that aren't really labeled the way human relationships are and don't have this physical sexual component to them. And this book very much highlights that, in the sense that as soon as Lestat returns to the human state in the form of this other body, he's just like, oh my god, I'm horny. What is this? Make it go away. I hate it. Stop. Please. I know this body is feeling this thing, but I hate it. Make it stop. Go away. Which I feel like is an experience any ace person who actually like has a libido or anything can relate to on some degree, because it's just like, yes, I'm feeling the feeling, but no, I don't actually have the desire to act on it. Please make it go away. Granted, Lestat does act on it because he's like, I can't help myself, and it's very problematic, but there are shades of a lot of different things in this book that are very queer, both implicitly and explicitly, and it is just a very great book in the series that is wonderful to read on its own. So highly recommend The Tale of the Body Thief. Next up, we have a book I've already talked about and done a full review on, Poor Pretty Creature. This is a book by Kira Kin. They went by a different name when they put out this book. I'm not going to show that name on screen today, because even though that's the name you're going to be able to find this book under, I don't want to disrespect Kira in any way by dead naming them, because I know they have put that name out there themselves before to be like, yeah, this is the name I used when I put out this book. You can check it out under that name. But I don't want to use that name now, because that's not really my choice to make. That's entirely theirs to make. So I will be linking Kira's channels, both Kira Kin and Lunar Tales Carnival, their more recent channel, in the description down there, so you can check out their content and see their own promotions of the book down there. But once again, this is a book I've already reviewed on my channel, but I wasn't really out as anything when I reviewed it, so I kind of was scooting around a bunch of different things. But this is a very, very queer book. It follows a protagonist who doesn't really remember a lot of things about herself and then wakes up chained to a bed in a place she's never seen before. And she's just like, why am I chained to this fucking bed? Get me out of here. And then this guy named Jonathan starts checking in on her and kind of studying her. And then she starts having flashes of how she got there. And spoiler alert, she's a vampire. She was turned by a vampire named Mircalla, who is very much a nod to the character of Carmilla Mircalla from the original Carmilla story. She has to find her way out of the keepings of this very misogynistic cult, basically referred to as the Fathers, that is this wannabe vampire hunting organization that's actually just a bunch of shitty patriarchal people that kind of just represent the patriarchy in a lot of ways. So this book is not particularly subtle about what its message is. It is very much exploring monstrousness and otherness as power and using that to fight the patriarchy, but it does it both while homaging a bunch of classic vampire literature that I love, such as Carmilla and Dracula, and even The Vampire by John Polidori and Varney the Vampire, which I have not actually read because it's stupidly long. It does that, and then it also looks at monstrousness and sort of being this othered thing, ultimately being a thing of power, but the way you are told from the outset that there is something wrong with you, and this aggressive way that is kind of beaten down, and the way you can kind of internalize that and be like, I'm the villain of the story, there's something morally wrong with me for doing what I'm doing, and the way that can kind of hinder your progress, and the way even other people that the protagonist interacts with who are being abused by the people around them will kind of refuse help from her because they see her as other and monstrous, and they've already internalized those things too. Even without directly addressing the queer components of the story, in my earlier review of this, I will link that review because I do think I talk about all of those aspects a lot more in depth. But just in general, please check out this fantastic book. I cannot recommend it enough, and check out both of Kira's excellent channels as well. The last book thingy I'm going to recommend is Carmilla's Return by Rhea Wrigley, which is a webcomic that is still ongoing currently. It's another Carmilla-based thing, I know. Rhea is a trans woman, a lesbian, and one of the only other people I know aside from playwright and author David McDowell Blue, who is as rabidly obsessed with Carmilla as I am. She is currently in the process of releasing multiple installments of a webcomic that details what Laura and Carmilla do following the events of the original Sheridan Le Fanu novella, including, how is Carmilla still a character? How does she reattach her head or anything like that? And also giving Carmilla herself an even more in-depth backstory. I have not seen it to its conclusion because the whole thing has not been released yet, but I love Rhea's art style. I love the overall sentiment of the story, and the overall vibe is very much my thing. So I will try to link the Bandcamp for Rhea's band Karnstein, which is also fantastic, where you can check out and buy the different installments of Carmilla's Return. And while we're on the topic of Carmilla, I did also just briefly want to say, I read the novelization of the Carmilla web series, which I adore and highly recommend. I talked about it before in my last LGBTQIA+ horror video, and I also finally saw the Carmilla movie that is the follow-up to the series, which is another 10 out of 10 great story that I highly recommend checking out. This book, written by Kim Teresi, is definitely cool if you want to see more of Silas University beyond what we see in Laura's webcam, and if you want to just explore that world a lot further. But it also dumbs down a lot of the great dialogue that's in the show while adding more swearing for some reason. Some of the dialogue is just gone that I thought was so great, and it avoids a lot of the nuance of the relationship between Laura and Carm to really cut to the chase and add more romantic scenes, and I feel like it's really kind of sidelining the main Buffy-esque apocalyptic plot that I love so much, just to make way for more vampire romance, which I love a good queer vampire romance, but it doesn't hit quite the same way. Not to mention the fact that La Fontaine is openly genderqueer, non-binary from the beginning of the book in this, and yet still gets misgendered multiple times from Laura's perspective, which I know, like, people slip up and misgender people sometimes. It's just a human mistake that happens. But it doesn't feel deliberate. It feels like the author forgot, and that just makes me cringe. So I don't hate this. It's just unsatisfying to me as someone who has obsessively watched the web series multiple times. I will probably read it again at some point, though, because it's fun. And also, I overall just love the design of the book. So this is kind of an iffy recommend. I enjoyed reading it as a Carmilla obsessive, but it does not hit the same way as the web series, and I highly recommend just going and watching the web series. And that brings us to our second section, which is movies. So the first movie I'm going to recommend is Knife Plus Heart. This came out a few years back now. It is a take on the overall Italian giallo style of film, very Dario Argento-esque, albeit set in France rather than Italy in the 70s, taking place almost entirely within the gay porn industry. Our main character is the actual director of a lot of these films, and she is madly in love with this other lesbian character who works in the editing room cutting together the movies she makes. And apparently they had some kind of relationship before that got broken up, and so she is just desperately trying to win back her affections by making this masterpiece of a queer erotic movie. But in the middle of all of that, this murder mystery that she's trying to solve arises because this mysterious black-gloved giallo killer, a la most Dario Argento movies, has started killing off multiple actors and sex workers she has worked with in the past, using one of the most unique murder weapons I've ever seen in a movie, being the dildo switchblade. Obviously, the cops aren't going to be much help, so it's up to her and her co-workers to try and solve this mystery while at the same time she is trying to reconnect with her ex-girlfriend, basically. And this is a movie full of queer characters that get brutally murdered and toxic relationships between queer characters that violate boundaries and are not resolved happily, and awful things happen. It doesn't feel like this punching down awful thing the way a lot of the, bury your gays and toxic representations of queerness appear in a lot of other things, because with the exception of a few outside characters, essentially every single character that we're interacting with in the world of this movie is queer, works within the sex worker industry or the porn industry, or usually some combination thereof. It is very much set within this queer underground of 70s France. And in the same way, it is this very kind of normalized sex positive movie without really fetishizing its characters. Granted, if there was any movie where there was going to be some kind of equal opportunity nudity in it, it would have been this one. That doesn't really happen, though. Blood of the Tribids still kind of blows it out of the water in that respect, but I don't really care. I just got really attached to these characters that are very much the kinds of characters that would be the token queer prostitute in an Argento or a Fulci movie, but that's just the whole cast of this movie, and it's this very much a celebration of this underground world while also showing these very specific horrific struggles that are completely contained within this world. And I just love that the whole movie is the queer rep. It's not one side character or a few characters. It's the whole movie. And it's also just beautifully filmed, beautifully scored. It takes all of the best things about those 70s giallo movies and adds a lot more substance and uniqueness to its characters in a way that I think is beautiful. And if you want to hear me talk about this movie much more in depth, you can check out my discussion of this film on Felicia of Girly Gore's channel, where we talked about it during Giallo Month of her horror movie club. I will try to link that either up here or in the description. The next movie I want to talk about is Uncle Peckerhead, another fairly recent movie. This one is not so much outright queer or about queer stuff as it just has a queer sensibility to it. It is about this little up-and-coming punk band that can't get a gig called Duh, who end up hiring this weird hillbilly man named Uncle Peckerhead, yes, that's his name, to drive them from place to place, and he really is able to help lift their band to these higher heights, while at the same time turning into a demon and having to consume human flesh at certain parts of the night. And that kind of causes a rift between certain members of the band, as well as in between the main character and Peckerhead himself. There is this both kind of very punk DIY punching up fuck you sensibility that is just very punk, but also there are just brief normalized moments of queerness throughout the movie where it's just like, oh, there's this little brief homoerotic moment, and just tiny little things throughout the movie that just add this wonderfully queer sensibility to it that doesn't really get addressed, but just is in there in a way that feels nice to me. It just kind of makes me happy. And the whole movie's just a cheesy, low-budget, gory romp in a lot of ways. So I would highly recommend checking it out. Next, I want to recommend the film version of Carmilla from 2019/2020. I included it in my favorite horror movies of 2020 because that's when it kind of sort of officially came out here. I don't know. This is an interesting adaptation of Carmilla in that it never outright says that Carmilla is a vampire. It doesn't totally change the story in any way. It does make Mademoiselle de La Fontaine, or Miss Fontaine in this version, this very stern Christian kind of governess character to Laura, but it keeps this kind of passionate young love relationship between Carmilla and Laura without ever outright saying that Carmilla's a vampire, but hits most of the same beats as the original story, kind of showing confusion that manifests in horrific ways in Laura, because this is not something she's been exposed to before, and she's not really sure what the feelings she's feeling are, so it kind of manifests as this horrifying nightmare imagery for her in some ways. And then the ending, which is very bury your gaze still, as was the original ending of the novel, displays the kind of internalized guilt and prejudice and tendency to lash out in the worst kind of horrifying ways that can manifest when queerness shows itself in places that are super duper homophobic. So yeah, it's not my favorite adaptation of Carmilla, but it is a beautiful period piece. I think the performances are great, and it is still an overall phenomenal movie in my eyes, even if it isn't the most happy representation of queerness or the most vampire-y version of Carmilla. And the last movie I want to talk about is, very briefly, Carousel II. I've already talked about this movie before. It is the sequel to the Carousel Unicorn slasher movie, Carousel, but I'm including it on this list because it is following a chaotic, murderous, bisexual carousel unicorn who's on a redemption arc from his past of senseless murder in order to save his half-human son, one slaughtered Nazi at a time. And if that is not the queerest thing I've heard in my entire life, I really don't know what is. On to TV. So the TV shows I'm going to talk about aren't really things that I think have gone under the radar per se, because I'm running out of TV shows to talk about. And there are a few obvious things that I know I still need to check out, namely the Chucky TV series, What We Do in the Shadows, and pretty much every season of American Horror Story, but these are the ones that I like that I did not talk about last time I made a video, and the ones that if you haven't seen them yet are very much worth your time. And the first of those is going to be Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which I talk about a lot. Despite Joss Whedon being an absolute horrible piece of shit, there are a lot of other aspects to this show that I think are amazing and amazingly queer. You obviously have things like the great relationship between Willow and Tara, which does to some degree erase Willow's bisexuality. Also, as much as I love Dark Willow, and as much as I love episodes like Once More with Feeling and Tabula Rasa, fuck the ending of season 6, I'm never forgiving you. But you've got an explicitly queer relationship there that I think is beautiful. Tara is also just one of my favorite characters on the show. She's very awkward in this way that I relate to. But on top of that, there are also just these very queer-coded things to it. Even the way Buffy is a Slayer and kind of has to come out to her mom as being a Slayer, and the kind of dynamic between Buffy and Faith, and the dynamic between Angel and Spike even, and then just the overall kind of otherness of the Scooby Gang. There's just this kind of overall feel of queerness to that I love. So it's far from perfect, but I'm absolutely obsessed with this show, and it's been talked about in much more high-profile places by other people, but I highly recommend checking out the podcast Slayerfest 98 if you do want very in-depth queer readings on a bunch of different episodes of the show. But yes, it is 7 seasons long, but I adore this show and highly recommend checking it out. I'm towards the end of season 4 of Angel right now. I'm still enjoying it. Definitely doesn't hit the high points that Buffy does for me, but I'm enjoying it. And then I also did want to briefly bring up Penny Dreadful, which I can't believe I didn't mention before, because basically every character on that is some permutation of bisexual or pansexual. And you've got Dorian Gray being amazingly queer. You've got an actual trans female character who does not meet a happy end, unfortunately, but I loved her while she was there. And there are other things about the show that just have a queer sensibility to me, like the overall arc of the Bride of Frankenstein character, who is just this aggressively almost evil feminist character who wants to cut off the right hand of every man in London. And Dorian Gray's just kind of like, yeah, I'm going to go along with this. Here, you can stay in my house. He has ulterior motives. It's very messy and all kinds of unhealthy relationships, but I love those characters, and there's just all kinds of wild queerness that was already kind of inherent in these classic pieces of gothic horror all throughout that show anyway. I'm going to make a brief shout out to Castlevania because, one, Carmilla's in it, but then also you have 2 other Styrian vampires in her castle who are just this persistently battle-ready lesbian couple, and that's just kind of who they are. It's never really addressed or anything. They're just kind of there, and it's just like, cool. That's my pitch for Castlevania. There's a lot of other cool reasons to watch Castlevania, but I was just like, I'm running out of shows to talk about. I like Castlevania. Here. And then the other kind of obvious one to talk about is The Haunting of Bly Manor, which is the follow-up to Mike Flanagan's The Haunting of Hill House series, which obviously has a wonderful lesbian couple in it who have kind of a bleak, bittersweet ending for their story, but not in the mortifying bury your gays way that you get in most things. But also the show just explores, once again, kind of internalized confusion and guilt over your identity that can manifest, especially when coupled with trauma, and that's done through ghosts. Yeah, other people have covered that in much more depth than me. I don't need to cover it in more depth here. You should just go and check out the series. And lastly, I just want to briefly shout out some of my favorite queer horror content creators. They are mostly people who I am friends with and have talked about on this channel before, but I just wanted to shout them out again because I think they are worth recognition. So firstly, I want to recommend Tristan Collects. I've talked about them on my channel many a time before, albeit that was when their channel was under a different name. They are biromantic and asexual and recently came out as bigender, and they collect a bunch of entertainment stuff, including horror, as they will say at the beginning of all of their videos. They also do a lot of live stream collaborations, including some with me, and they've done some movie reviews, some music covers, and just generally a lot of cool stuff, so go check them out. The next one I'm going to talk about is Dylan Mintis Reviews. I believe they are non-binary. I know they identify with something that is not within the gender binary. I don't know what actual label they use though, so Dylan, let me know. They have just an overall really enjoyable vibe to their videos, great fashion sense, and I really enjoy their takes on a lot of different movies, many of which are horror, but not necessarily all of them. They have also done some great collaborations with Tristan on Tristan's channel, talking about the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, and on their own channel with Tristan talking about Halloween Kills. Thirdly, I want to bring up Dice Rollin' again. I've talked about them a lot. They are non-binary, demisexual, and biromantic. They do a lot of just great horror movie reviews, gameplay videos, reaction videos, and things you didn't know about, insert movie here, fact videos that are really cool. I wanted to specifically highlight them right now because they have been doing some really great videos about kind of important horror in queer history during this month. I watched their videos on The Haunting not too long ago, which were really good, and they have put out videos on the 80s vampire classic The Hunger that I'm looking forward to checking out. So Dice Rollin's awesome. You should know this by now. Go check their stuff out. And then lastly, another kind of given in my eyes is Gory B Movie. She has for a long time been one half of the Horror Addicts. She's also pansexual and wonderfully supportive, and she does a lot of different deep dive horror movie reviews that I think are fantastic, very specifically highlighting a lot of lesser known B movies. She also has been doing a lot of live streams recently trying to create brackets of different kinds of horror characters that are going to duke it out and fight. I very specifically wanted to highlight her here because she did a post on Twitter highlighting a bunch of other queer horror creators, myself included, and I was very grateful for that. You should go check out her Twitter and check out all of those people too. But I wanted to return the favor here. And yeah, that's about everything I have to talk about here. If you have other queer horror stuff you want to recommend, be it books, movies, TV, content creators, if you have a piece of horror media that has error or ace representation in it that I don't know about, please let me know what it is. And if you yourself are a queer horror content creator, feel free to promote yourself to me in the comments. That is the video. Thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye!